Hi everyone, I am Clay Spinuzzi, Professor of Rhetoric and Writing at the University of Texas, Austin, and this is our part 3 of our video series, The Regular Production of Innovation. Here we're going to be talking about a critical issue in third-generation activity theory, which is the question of disruptions. And the question is, how's the transformation of the object disrupted? As people try to transform a networked object, what disruptions do they encounter and how do they handle them? Now, we can think of an activity as happening at 3 co-constitutive levels. These levels come to us straight from Ian Leontief's work, in which he talks about activities, actions, and operations. This question gets picked up throughout a lot of early third-generation activity theory. So Engström's work really focuses on activities and contradictions across those activities. If you look at Böttcher's early work, she talks about these levels, activities, actions, and operations, and really focuses quite a bit on the action and operation levels. If you look at my book Topside, I talk about these in quite a lot of detail as well. The macro level is the level of activities. You can think of this as the Y level. Think in terms of slowly unfolding culture, history. It's related to the objects and the outcomes. It's usually unconscious, these activities. We typically don't think too much about the activities in which we're involved. If you stop somebody as they're writing a proposal and you say, "What are you doing?" they will tend not to say, "I'm creating shareholder value." They'll tend to say, "I'm writing a proposal." That means that they are, like most people, focusing on the action level, the meso here. Actions and goals, it's conscious, it's on the level of minutes, hours, or days. This is where we mostly live. This is where we spend most of our time, even though it has the backdrop of these larger activities. The third level is the micro level of operations. You can think of these as habits and reactions. They're unconscious. When you stop somebody who's writing a proposal and say, "What are you doing?" they tend not to say, "I'm typing the letters P, R, O, P, O, S, A, L." That's definitely part of what they're doing, but these operations, things like typing, things like mouse clicks, are so habitual that we tend not to think about them unless something goes wrong. If your letter E is not working in your keyboard, you will, when you type a word that has the letter E in it and E does not appear in the word, you will shift your focus from the action to that operation, which has kind of broken down. So these levels, we can give you examples of different things from our case. Macro level of activities, you're developing value proposition for product or service. Meso level, maybe you're writing a positioning statement expressing that value proposition. Micro level, you're typing. Each of these is related to a specific disruption. At the macro level of activities, you might run into a contradiction. The value proposition may be fundamentally misaligned with the client's offering. At the meso level, you might have a discoordination. The entrepreneur doesn't have enough information to identify competitors. And at the micro level, you might have a breakdown. Maybe you fat finger it or mistype a word, and then you have to shift your focus to that word and correct it. 3 co-constitutive levels. What we're going to do in this video series is talk about just this level of activity and the contradictions involved. Contradictions. To quote Engström 1987, the basic internal contradiction of human activity is its dual existence as the total societal production and as one specific production among many. Within the structure of any specific productive activity, the contradiction is renewed as the clash between individual actions and the total activity system. Well, let's break that down a little bit. Contradictions can include primary contradiction. Engstrom says there's an inner conflict between exchange value and use value within each corner of this triangle of activity. Whether you're talking about instruments, subject, rules, community, division, labor, object, or outcome, there's that primary contradiction in all capitalist society, he says, between exchange and use value. But there are also secondary contradictions. He says they appear between the corners. So maybe, for instance, there is a contradiction between how an instrument is put together and how a subject or individual sees that instrument. Or you might see a contradiction between the rules that the individual is trying to follow and the needs of the community. Then there's tertiary contradictions. When representatives of a culture, like teachers, introduce the object and motive of a culturally more advanced form of the central activity into the dominant form of the central activity, there might be two different objects, one of which is culturally more advanced. We see this a lot in education, including entrepreneurship training programs. But there's also quaternary contradictions, conflicts with the essential neighbor activities linked with the central activity, which is the original object of our study, he says. And it's this quaternary type of contradictions that's going to be our real focus here, because we're looking at objects of an activity network. For the value proposition, these contradictions might involve warrants, cycles, or problems and roles. And we'll take these together really quickly. Warrants, this is drawn from the model of argumentation by Stephen Toulmin. Warrants are shared assumptions that connect claims and evidence. And one example, we're going to go back to case 6015, the magnet case. And here, as you remember, they claimed that the innovation is based on a new rule of magnetic flux flow, but the TACR, the commercialization report, is released to entrepreneurs just 2 weeks before the final pitch, after pitch training, and it has quotes from experts that say things like this: the explanation is bizarre, what they're observing may be real, but the explanation is incorrect. It contradicts accepted physics and opens this technology to criticism. Disbelief from experts. This is not where you want to be 2 weeks before you have to give your final pitch. So, K6015 changed the pitch up. Pitch deck focus shifted from proposing applications, which is what they were really mostly focusing on before. Remember, they were talking about things like aerospace and transformer robots. They realized that they had to prove the technology. They had to back up and demonstrate that it was actually real. So they restructured the pitch deck. They expanded their technical description from just 5 slides to 14. They replaced hot button claims like a new rule of magnetic flux flow with preferentially forming magnetic flux flow, control of magnetic flux flow. They included testimony from the patent evaluator, and importantly, they included a hands-on demo. They actually brought their innovation in and demonstrated it repeatedly. So, let's go to cycles. These are relatively undiscussed in literature. Each activity has one. They don't always sync up, and they kind of have to sync up for a shared object to be developed in a way that's going to hold together and be coherent. In this particular case, the stakeholders of the training program included the government or public. They wanted a 9 plus 3 month cycle for the simple reason that the governor liked to make announcements about the results of this program every year. It helped him in his re-election process. On the other hand, private businesses had variable cycles from just months to 7 plus years. If your innovation is a consumer product, and it doesn't have to undergo much regulatory review. It could be out on the shelves in a few months. If you're selling to the automotive industry or the healthcare industry, you're talking about 7 years before you can certify it, and commercialize it. And then you have the academic or higher education stakeholders, including the university that underwrote the program, and they were really looking at cycles of decades. These different cycles obviously didn't sync up, but they used this set of transformations, these genres, to develop basic synchronization. They used it to screen out those innovations that couldn't fit development into a 9+3 month cycle. They used the genres to deliver specific insights and specific developmental milestones at a unified schedule, forcing a pace of development. And, for instance, the application phase, they asked, can these really fit? If it's something like licensing, just the principle like magnets, then it's easy to fit them. If it's consumer products, the question is, have they already been marketed in Korea? Can they be moved out to different markets with ease? Do they have a track record? And of course, if it's automotive or healthcare, the question is, are they already through with testing? Do they have certification in the target market? If so, we can move on from there. And the lesson, of course, is that products in different markets had to start from different points in order to work in this training program. Now let's get to this last kind of contradiction, problems and roles. One quick example also from the Korean training program is a brake spring. The brake spring was coated on one side. The coating reduced friction, improved corrosion resistance, and reduced high frequency and vibrations and noise. And this is what the entrepreneur wanted to do, to describe the product and to describe a very basic way in which the product would be useful for people. It would make the brake springs quieter. Automakers had no interest in this. Brake springs are cheap. Cars are soundproofed against road noise. It's not adding any value to them. And then something wonderful happened, at least something that was wonderful from the innovator's perspective, which is that a highly publicized safety issue with Toyota accelerators meant that markets suddenly became more sensitized to safety issues. This spring did not directly relate to the issue of Toyota accelerators, but it could be repackaged to demonstrate that cars with these springs would be safer. The brake spring coated on one side would lengthen the life of the brake spring and therefore improve safety. The product didn't change. The entrepreneur used it to propose a solution. We call this a shift to service-dominant logic. Vargo and Lush talk about this in the marketing literature. The result, the company is now a global supply leader in the brakes market. So, yay for them. Here's another case that was not as successful. Food scrap recycler. A Korean company develops a machine, it's about the size of a washing machine, to turn food scraps into dry powder and water. The idea is you just scrape your plate into this machine. They showed videos and it really looked disgusting. But after hours, you get powder, which could be used as animal feed and fertilizer, and pure water. They had sales in Korea. They already had a track record. They wanted to expand it to global markets. They pitched this to market stakeholders in the U.S., and the response was essentially, well, why do we need this? Don't Koreans have garbage disposals in their sinks? And the answer is no, they don't. Korea doesn't allow sink disposals. The product fills a niche created by the regulation. The US does allow sink disposals, so US customers just didn't face any regulatory pressure to solve the problem. Entrepreneurs could not interest US audiences in this product. So these quaternary contradictions are key in an activity theory analysis of emergent objects of activity networks. As we've discussed, the object of an activity network, as a sense integrator, as emergent, as synchronized, is off balance. It's temporarily stabilized. It's vulnerable to these quaternary contradictions, especially because the component activities are all developing at different paces. And this leads us to Uriah Engstrom's insight, which applies in social production, peer production, of course, but I think also to other cases of emergent shared objects. He says we need a fourth generation activity theory to better understand how activity networks develop. The boundaries and structures of activity systems seem to fade away. Processes become simultaneous, multidirectional, often reciprocal. This density and crisscrossing of processes makes the distinction between processes and structure obsolete. And the movements of information create textures that are constantly changing, but not arbitrary or momentary. Okay, so that's it for our video series. Next, I will talk to you in class discussion. Thanks so much, guys.